Alright, so welcome everyone to the Halloween discussion on how to write horror stories in RP and make a big bad slash threat dangerous. So, the sort of first thing to get into business is, why actually write horror in RP? Well, obviously, the first answer, it's always going to be there, is it's fun. People love writing horror. People love horror as a genre. Gets the blood flowing. People like being surprised. They like feeling a little bit of fear or that they're powerless when they're reading a particular story, especially when they have a favourite character or they want the story to go a particular way. When there's a hanger of are these people actually going to survive, or is this actually going to be, going ahead? They definitely enjoy that. Secondly, it's another avenue for storytelling, and it does its part. Horror is really good for suspense, and it's really good to show the darker parts of both society and the potential universe, Especially in Ancerious, not everything is sunshine, rainbow, and everyone having fun. There are some dark and pretty terrifying things out there that, go bump in the night and want, to eviscerate you lovingly with their long claws and dimensional appendages. And so it is interesting to explore those different areas of a setting. And it is interesting to introduce horror into such a setting to help mix it up a little, so it's not just endless diplomacy and warfare and, characters running around doing stuff. Sometimes people need to run away from things that go bump in the night and get lovingly eviscerated by them. Another good reason of why write horror is that it helps solidifying terrifying characters, entities, or threats. If you want some big, bad, super evil thing, be that a character or, this evil god or a big threat that's coming to the setting in general, a good way to actually make those horrifying is through writing them in some sort of, horror scenario, or making them so that they are legitimately scary. So, it's quite hard to make something that is kind of big, bad, scary, and people should be afraid of it if you don't actually put it into those constraints, so to say. And then lastly, everyone appreciates good horror in stories. It doesn't have to be true horror. It can literally be a case of just making people feel powerless. But everyone sort of appreciates that kind of approach to writing, and I think that it is one that should be used in RP, just like everything else, and it has its place and use in story. So, the big crux is, how does horror actually work in an RP and between players in a setting? Well, there's a number of aspects we need to go through, but first off, horror typically works in RP by one player having the sort of I guess, inverted commas, horrifying aspect. They're the sort of pseudo-GM that describes the surroundings of a particular horrifying location. They're the ones who write up the ambience, direct the plot, describe the setting, and roleplay the direct threats, like, your big stalking alien going through the ventilation ducts, or the big ghouly ghosties in the ancient crypts that you decided to go and explore. So, you would more or less set it up like any other RP, where you have a number of people, different players that are joining, typically playing different characters, and then you would have somebody who is maybe the GM, maybe they do have a character of their own, but they're used in a more guiding fashion. So they're like, we need to go to this location, or this has happened, and then something can happen to them later on for added effect if need be. So it's key, when role-playing horror, to remember the fundamentals. Don't godmod or power play. That's like a crux. Many people think that when they write horror, it's terrifying if they control every aspect. So, while it might seem to a reader who is not in the RP that, oh my god, Myrick just killed Canis's character, for example, out of nowhere, with this, big scary monster, Canis is probably going to go, what the fuck, dude? After I just godmodded the hell out of his character and killed him out of nowhere. That's what you want to avoid, at all costs. As well as that, if you're going to be partaking on the flip side, don't bring in characters that are, for whatever silly reason, immune to like horror in the typical sense. So, for example, I'm the GM of this horror RP, and a bunch of people have joined, and somebody decides that instead of bringing, say, some freelancer to check out these ancient burial crypts, they're going to bring an AI that is not programmed to feel fear. Or they're going to bring some super mega epic soldier who doesn't feel fear. Or they're going to bring some entity that doesn't feel threatened and can just defeat the horrors easily with a flick of their wrist. That completely destroys the whole point of the RP. If you're bringing those characters to an RP that somebody says, hello, I want this to be a sort of horror thing, maybe not everyone's going to survive. The last thing is, if you then think, oh, I'll bring my super soldier, or I'll bring X thing that is going to detract from the plot, you shouldn't be bringing that to the RP. You want to bring people who actually fit into the setting of that roleplay. Be that like random dudes from a nation, freelancers, mercenaries, people with reasons to be there, but also reasons to be absolutely terrified out of their minds. So, again, if you're going to be GMing with some of these plots, always be open with what the intent of the RP is. If it is to show off some terrifying threat, or to be a horror RP, if you intend to kill characters in it for added effect, or just be like, people are not going to come out of this alive, tell the players who are involved at the very start. Talk to them in PMs, even if you don't necessarily want to reveal stuff to the wider audience who may be reading the RP, or even to each individual player. Talk to players in PMs regarding maybe possible locations in the story for where their character death might take place. So, I'm in an RP with Canis, Chris, and Drac, and they've all got random people. Now, they all have been told from the start that their characters are probably going to die in this RP, but I'm not going to reveal to them exactly when each of them might die. So will then PM each of them and say, okay, this is my overall plan for the RP. Where would you like your character to possibly get offed in a dramatic way? And then they might go, okay, let's do it in this location because it's interesting. Now, when it comes to the actual RP moment, Chris and Canis don't know that Drac's character is essentially going to get, like, yeeted out of nowhere. So they're going to be like, oh, okay, so that's where he goes then. Alright, that's pretty crazy. And then so on and so forth. But the readers who aren't even in that RP are going to be like, oh shit, that was sudden. Okay, and they're going to be kind of taken aback. Pretty much that's what you want to do. You don't want to just start killing characters willy-nilly. It angers and annoys players. But if you work with players individually, they may be surprised with what happens in the Great Whole, and you may be able to make it flow a lot better as well. So, this kind of fits into the whole description is key as well. When writing horror or any sort of major evocative writing, use descriptions to your full advantage. What do the characters see? What do they hear? How do the surroundings make them feel? What do they smell? Can they touch anything that's particularly, interesting? What does the setting radiate in terms of overall mood? You obviously can't and never should write what player characters themselves are feeling, but you could use description in such a way as to help any reader or character responding to the situation what you would like them to feel or, see from a distance. So, this kind of also ties in with subverting expectations. And this is a great thing to do in horror. The suddenness of character death, the revealing of a malign terror, or the development of some horrifying revelation in the plot can all add with that, oh, okay, shit factor that I like to say, to people both in the RP and those who are reading it. Graphic descriptions can help with this, but it's a fine spice, and you want to use it in moderate amounts, and we'll talk on that a bit later. An abstract description can really help, and it is worth reading some of the great old horror stories and books to get a feeling of that writing standard. But it is one of those things where You really can't write horror RP if you're not willing to put in the depth of description required to help set the scene, the tone, and help characters react to such. Because otherwise you're just writing a normal RP with some spooky bits here and there. So, as you're sort of writing these in-depth situations in your posts, you want to be guiding the players slowly. You want to make them confused in character, or even out of character if you want. Are they supposed to go down that seemingly safe corridor? It's a straight line to the bridge, but there is a creature on the loose. Do they go across the hull and take the risk of being threatened out in the open with nowhere covered to be? You can, essentially force players to take these tough decisions, but always give them multiple avenues and always reward them for being, actually smart about things. But you can put pressure on them. You can make characters feel stressed and unsure and make them doubt themselves, as anyone would in such scary situations. It might be a case of where players go to you, well, what do you think we would do? What would be the best? And you say, it's completely up to you. I'm not going to guide you on this bit. This is for you to work out yourself. And then it's down to them to choose a myriad of different options that you've given them, where they think they're making the right choice, but in reality they could be walking straight into a trap and their character might, not come out of it. So, in addition to this, the setting of the RP should always help and reinforce the horror. For example, the film Alien is set on a ship where the creature can run around through the air vents and all the different nooks and crannies on the vessel, hindering the crew's attempts of containment, understanding it, tracking it down, potentially killing it. But if this was on an open planet, where the alien could just run off somewhere, and there's lots of open plains and paddy fields, it would kind of completely detract from the atmosphere of the horror, and it would be a completely different setting. You want to make the setting fit the RP. If that's some weird underground crypt from the ancient past, a very small merchant spaceship, some old rundown space station, it doesn't matter. You always want to use it as a tool to help you in telling the story of, this horror RP. So, next up is how to avoid being too overbearing when it comes to horror. So, obviously the first one that we've gone over is don't godmod, but also don't railroad the characters into feeling specific things or going through specific directions. As I said, give them choices on how to approach a scary situation. Guide them, offer them multiple paths, each with their own horrors, but don't force them into any situations. If you forced your characters into a situation where it's like, oh, you've got to run down this corridor and there's definitely something down there that's like super scary and one of you is going to die and I'll write who it is in the next post, people are going to be like, oh, great, okay, but I swear that you mentioned some maintenance hatch like a couple posts ago or like whatnot, or I've been on the lookout for alternate routes and you basically have ignored that or whatnot. Don't railroad. Give resources to them. Let them work it out for themselves what they want to do. If they take the wrong decision, they take the wrong decision. That's down to them. Now, on the topic of the description, as I said, don't drown your posts in it. Ensure that players have plenty of plot hooks and things to respond to in your post. Otherwise, if you've just written 4 entire paragraphs about, down to the last atom on this, like, spooky cafeteria that's got flickering lights and there's bloodstains on the walls, but you don't actually tell them, like, there's a door over there, there's another door over there, there's some stuff in the caf that, you may be able to use as improvised weapons, there's some rations as well that you can eat, and there's some claw marks on the wall that, maybe look a bit suspicious that you can investigate. If you don't give them plot hooks, they're just going to stand there like, okay, what do I do now? Because you've not given them any hooks to actually move on to in their post. So, again, as stated, don't kill characters without at least hinting to it and building up to it, or discussing it prior with players. Don't go overboard with graphic descriptions. We'll get to that in a bit. Don't go overboard with truly obscene tier horrors in regards to creating creatures or entities that are super powerful for that particular RP. For example, my little RP that I'm running with Canis, Chris, and Drag. It's a small RP, it's not linked to anything big, it's just they've decided that, there's a space station that's gone dark and they've gone to check it out. Small space station, about 75 people on board. They just need to get to the command bridge and the reactor and the engineering just to find out what the hell happened here. But I have that there's a creature on board. Now, is it a regular, sort of horrible creature that you might find from some, Death World? No, it's a crazy interdimensional entity capable of, ripping you apart with its mind. Well, that's kind of a bit out of the scope for the RP, let's face it, because surely if those things exist, then it has lock-on effects. Where the hell does it come from? What's it linked to? Your best to bet is to just go with something that makes sense in terms of the story. Otherwise, you're just going to absolutely bog yourself down, and the RP is down, with just trying to work out what actually you are creating. And finally, a massive trope to avoid when being overbearing in writing horror, and just a really big no-no to do in general, it's just to avoid at all costs. If a horror RP involves an entity or a creature which, for the purposes of the RP, cannot be killed, you should always put in ways that the players can use to slow down or hinder or allow escape or a moment's respite from the creature. This can be through giving them items that they themselves will need to be smart about through their use, potential escape routes, or anything that can be there to essentially go, okay, you're going to have a sudden encounter with this crazy creature. Here's your options. Again, giving them options. Do you want to try and fight it off with a, cooking utensil? Or do you want to, use this escape hatch? You don't know where it leads, but you know it's away from the creature. Never, if you're going to be running some big crazy creature that's going to, be able to kill the crew, do you want to have it to be oh, well, it encounters you, so you're basically dead. Well, no. You always want to give people options, and you always want to give them ways to be able to, stop it from killing somebody, even if it's just for a turn or two, just to slow it down. If one character wants to sacrifice himself because he knows that he's basically, he's already crippled, he knows that he's trapped, but he can, fend off the beast for the other 3 RPers to get out of the room, let him do it. Have a really, cool last sort of stand and give the character his goodbyes before then having, the creature tearing him apart or something while the others look on with horror. Do that sort of thing. But you must avoid the trope of, oh, well, it can't be killed, so there's no way that you can stop it. It basically gets within range of you, you're dead. Because it's just boring. So, with this, what to avoid in terms of horror subjects. Now, there's always going to be no-nos in regards to horror. These are, in my opinion, the ones that you want to avoid in general, but also the ones that you definitely want to avoid in Ancerious. So the first one is excessive gore and body horror. Writing gore is fine in a horror RP. You could describe it, slicing his innards or something, to a degree. But if you then start going into, actual gore posting, I'm going to spend 3 paragraphs about how the creature is going to, slowly peel back his skin and, pick his eyes out with their, needle-like teeth, and while he's still alive and screaming, and, he can feel the pain, and you actually just go into that detail, no, you're not going to impress anyone. You're just going to turn off and disgust, all of the people in the RP and anyone who reads the RP. And if you really continue to do that and go into excessive detail, you're probably going to get a black mark from the admins as well, or at least us talking to you saying dude, calm down, because you've clearly got issues. On top of that, anything sexual, no. End of story. If you are trying to do anything regarding horror in a sexual manner at all, torture, forcing anything on anyone or whatnot, it's an extremely touchy subject for a lot of people, and it will instantly earn you a black mark if you try to pull that in RP. Just hands down. We have had that stuff before. It was a horrific instance. We are never going to have that again, and it should never have been there to start with. End of story. Next up, indescribable horrors. If you cannot describe a horror to the players, or the sheer terror of its presence, then you simply cannot do a good enough job to get it across. So this is kind of a thing where people go to love to use Lovecraft terminology, where they're like, oh, it's this indescribable horror beyond mortal comprehension. Well, that actually doesn't tell anyone anything, and it's kind of a cheap cop-out, because I want to know what the creature looks like. I want to know the thing that's, pursuing my characters. It's the same in any horror film. Everyone waits for the moment in horror films where the big bad or the creature gets revealed in some way, usually after teasing bits of it throughout the movie, where we get to see it in full and marvel at its true horrifying nature. If it's beyond comprehension, you can't effectively write it because it's beyond your comprehension as a writer. It's a cheap cop-out to effectively go, oh, it's so scary that you can't imagine it, because I can't imagine it and I don't want to put in the effort to write it. It's such a crutch used by writers trying to get, out of something and to create something truly terrifying. Most players get really disappointed when the big bad horror is revealed to be, only for it to be the whole, lol, sorry, you can't comprehend here, better luck next time. Nobody likes that sort of thing. The next one is big meme subversions. So, as I said, subverting expectations is always an interesting part of RP. Maybe one of the crew has already been, infected by whatever horrific thing, and that gets revealed later on. Or, maybe the actual monster was released as part of some sort of government effort, an experiment that they didn't realise. Or, there's loads of different ways to subvert expectations from writing horror. But the ones not to do are the whole, you take the characters and the players on this massive winding story with twists and turns for this huge complicated plot full of horror and development, only for it to be oh, but the players were the true horror along the way, or humanity/sentience is the big bad after all, or it was just their minds playing tricks on them because they're so, depraved individuals or something. It's extremely cheap, completely obliterates everything you've done, and nobody will enjoy it. The whole, but the humans were the big bads along the way is so overdone as a trope that it's just so boring at this point. Next up, the last one is writing horror pieces with little in the way of the description of the ambience. You can't truly set up a scary sequence or a horror RP if you skimp out on the hard work. It would literally just be a normal RP with some monster running around after you. If you're not putting in the effort to write the ambience, the descriptors that allow the players to effectively feel like this is what we're in right now, this is what our characters are feeling, and this is the odds that are stacked against us. If you can't put in the effort to do those, why are you even running the RP? Is pretty much a response to that. So, moving away from horror for a moment, why have a scary, be-all, end-all, big bad threat? Well, because readers and writers love to have a scary end-tier boss for a setting. Something that is truly the final hurdle for a nation or a character, which will test them to the absolute extreme, and possibly test the setting itself to the very limits. Such big bad threats are usually extremely fun to write and develop, and can take the form of all sorts of concepts depending on the setting and its context, and the story up until that point. And it is very fun to put that all together. It's also very fun to see a well-developed nation or character, which is at the height of their power, face off against something which is completely beyond their ability to immediately defeat, and typically requires them to think outside the box to defeat it, or approach it from a completely different angle. and they typically make very flashy and very story-rich finales for any writing piece, whether in a group, book, or your own individual story. So, when do you actually introduce and show off these big bad threats? Well, a good technique with, a super big bad is to tease it and tease the presence of it ever so slightly throughout various stories, building up that there's something out there that's not quite right or beyond the scope of the current story arc. This is to hype up the reader and get players guessing about what could be next. Clearly there's something behind the scenes going on, and there's something that the main characters don't know about. Potentially tie this threat into each story arc preceding it, so to solidify its existence and the effects on the story so far. So, for example, you might have your big end arc for stories, but you might have several arcs before then. Tie it into those arcs, not just to try and tease it along the way, but to solidify it, to show it exists and it is involved in some way through these various stories that are going on. You know it's coming, you know there's something there, and that it's having an effect on the story. It isn't just out of nowhere. When tying this threat into other stories or arcs, you can also be extremely subtle with references or links, so that players or readers really need to pay attention and dig deep. All the signs will be there, they just have to put them together. But you need to make it in a way that they don't have to comb through at least 100 pages of lore to pick out little, snippets to actually put anything together. You don't necessarily want to go to that limit, because then everyone will accuse you of, pulling it out of nowhere. And any time where you decide in the finale to reveal your super big threat to a setting or a character or a story, it should be a monumental affair, which completely subverts the expectations of the reader and cements almost immediately the sheer threat of what this final big bad represents. Usually, it's through the destruction or death of a key story element or character. Everyone's going to be completely chill until one of the biggest nations in the galaxy suddenly gets absolutely steamrolled by whatever big evil endgame faction has just turned up to completely reset the scales. So, GG. Good example, Mass Effect. Everyone's, hip and happy, and then suddenly the Systems Alliance gets absolutely steamrolled when the Reapers turn up and go, "Hello there, my friends," and just completely annihilate Earth. Good example of that. That instantly shifts the entire setting and shows, oh shit, this is a problem. So, the key part to writing up big bads, and the answer that everyone sort of is seeking, questions they want to know, is how do you balance a big end-tier threat and make it credible as well as respected by the players or readers? And there's quite a lot of ways that you can do this, but all of them are really critical. So always make sure that your big bad threats, regardless of if they're superpowered character villains, they're extra-dimensional horrific horrors, or massive galactic threats, make sure they play by the same rules as the rest of your setting and all of the rest of your characters and factions. Never make them above the rules. The moment they are above the rules, it really degrades them, in my opinion, because they get more bonuses and they're more powerful than other player factions, for example, or characters within a setting, purely because they get, out of character power-ups? Okay, why? For example, in Ancerious, everyone has a ship limit, and everyone has a tech limit, and everyone has particular technology limits in regards to interdiction and If I pull out a super endgame threat for Ancerious and go, they have 1 billion ships, but they're also all god tech that is all barred from every other player, and they have FTL that's capable of completely bypassing interdiction, they are going to absolutely curb stomp the galaxy, but not because they're an actual legitimate threat in terms of the setting. but purely because I've given them out-of-character bonuses to completely and utterly circumvent the rules, and everyone is going to call bullshit on that. They're going to be like, well, why do these guys get god tech? Why do they completely overrule the interdiction, law? Because that's, like, absolutely solidified, and why do they get all of these ships out of nowhere? It would just completely ruin them. So, again, always make sure these big threats are well planned out. They're all written up, and their capabilities are laid out very, very clearly. Even if you're not revealing that to the player base, so for example, you might write up all of what their ships are capable of, their big bad characters, their motives, their reasoning, everything that details them. You might not reveal that all to the group and go, hey guys, here's all their information, but you should write it up and have it ready for when somebody asks, what's this? Or there's a situation in RP where you reveal something and they go, what's this? And then you reveal that information. Keep them consistent. Consistency is key to everything in story writing, and for finale big bads, it is like the creme de la creme. You need to have consistency, because if they're not consistent, you end up with stuff like the Rise of fucking Skywalker, where the Sith Eternal Empire is just a complete and total meme, where everyone was like, what? You don't want to end up with that. So, again, make sure they fit with the setting. An extra-dimensional magical incursion in a hard sci-fi setting makes absolutely no sense and ruins the entire backstory. And, it would be better, and for an example, fitting the setting, would be a unending von Neumann swarm, for example. Meanwhile, in a softer sci-fi, it could be dimensional threats, or some extremely powerful precursor nation, or just a myriad of other things that actually fit the setting. So, for example, in Ancerious, current big endgame bads that are sort of on the table, old invaders, von Neumann swarm from outside the galaxy. They've been dropped plenty of times, they're in an RP, they're in the lore. Everyone's like, oh, okay, this is quite interesting, and it fits. Again, Army of the Panopticon. They've been created in the lore, they're consistent in the setting, and they've actually been used to help create new things for the setting that increase the story. So, you always want to make sure that they fit. Again, as I said before, with drivers and motives, this is also key. The big bad needs a reason. It needs a drive to exist and pursue whatever goals it has. Big, endless, devouring swarms that kill mindlessly work for survival and for basic situations, but they are extremely hard to write and keep interesting from a story perspective. It is better to ensure that your big bad has an ultimate goal, which is actually, when boiled down to it, quite basic and quite simple. It could be that they believe in the ascension of all organic life, an AI that essentially just wants to turn all organic life into immortal AI just like itself. Or it could be the continued survival of a particular race at any cost. And if that requires them to use horrific precursor weapons that will wipe out all life in the rest of the galaxy, so be it. They have to do so. Or it could be the creation or destruction of a particular object, which is key to, a particular race's history. Or it could be any number of things to help determine their drive and motives. This should also be reflected in the actions that they take in RP and the story, and how such actions are reflected in the drive and goals. For example, they're not just randomly going to invade some, Globnarch 4 faction that has absolutely nothing to do with the story or plot. They're going to invade factions that are, actually involved in the story. This faction is a designated threat that did something in the past. Therefore, they get attacked. There's a motive behind that. This other faction has a particular entity or artifact that could pose a threat in the future. Boom, attacked. Etc. You always need to be there's a motive behind this, there's a motive and a goal for them to actually attain. They shouldn't be just herder, kill everything. So, this bit is a little bit harder, but big bads need to be unique. They need to have defining traits as a finale. And that requires, unfortunately, a great deal of intimate development, both in story for its build-up and existence, and for out of character in its designs, its technology, its motives, and its aesthetic for general existence. This includes big finale characters who should be defining. Nobody wants the whole of Ancerious, for example, would probably shoot me if we did all of these major stories. We did like 10 major arcs, okay? And it all led up to this massive moment when this big bad comes to Ancerious. And it literally is just the Zerg / the Tyranids / the Bethorian swarm. It's just generic, big, endless swarm, biological ships. There's, they're just here to eat. Everyone would shoot me. Nobody's interested in generic big bads. They want something interesting and they want something unique. They need to be cool. They need to have a defined aesthetic when somebody looks at one of their ships or soldiers and goes, holy shit, it's that faction. They're a fucking threat. Or if somebody posts up a design for them and goes, hey guys, this is the new ship that you're all going to be engaging in, and everyone goes, oh fuck, that looks terrifying. Like, there needs to be a defined thing that makes people go, or when anything is posted, or when it's in use. And if you can't pull that off, it's going to be very hard to get that effect. So, on that thought, your big bad does not actually need to be particularly technologically advanced to be a massive threat. Not all threats are about big, massive, grand-scale space opera fights and space battles, flashy technology, endless numbers, battleship wars, etc. Some big bads are about ideology, or philosophy, or a different approach to life. Your big bad finale could involve a living virus, or a psionic suggestion, or a completely unconventional threat which forces the characters and the players to think and adapt and fight something in totally new ways. A big nation's titanic military is completely useless if the big bad is a silent weapon, for example, and thus would completely subvert all player expectations who imagine the big finale to be an endless wall of precursor battleships with god tech. If you want to do something truly interesting, that would be the way to go. Things would change drastically. You could have a psionic suggestion that goes through your entire nation. What would you do? You've got no way to effectively counter it if you have no psionic technology, and anyone could be infected. It would induce riots across all of your world. Your government would be completely at its knees. It has no idea what to do. Your population would be tearing itself apart and going after each other. Anyone could be infected. Why not your neighbour who you fucking absolutely hate and has been trashing your lawn for the past 5 years? Just shoot him in the fucking head. Or report him to the authorities for displaying strange behaviour. It could be all of these different things that, while not technologically advanced, they don't have to be sort of, massive battleship wars. They could be something truly, alien to us. And this kind of also ties into subverting player expectations with big bads, is to actually have them directly intervene or get involved with galactic or character politics. And this can be through a whole myriad of different things, through manipulation, proxy factions. In regards to at least the unnamed, they're a good example of a possible end-tier threat, where they have countless proxy nations of manipulation throughout the galaxy, which are satellites, working for their cause. Or you could actually work with other players in the group and be like, hey, I'm doing this big bad. I know that this is a big ask, but would you be willing to have your faction get manipulated and act as a proxy for me? In which case players might go, absolutely, and they will work with you to undermine other players and the galactic community. All of a sudden, things are a lot easier for you. Anything which basically forces players to be, subverted and have to adapt to a situation is a good thing. And it can really reinforce a threat and also make players confused with how they deal with that threat. Especially even if the big galactic threat comes to the galaxy strikes up a chair at the Galactic UN and goes, "Sup, dudes? We have our own ideology. We have our own way of life. You should think about joining us." And everyone goes, "Oh fuck, how do we deal with this?" Because in the Ancerious way, isn't that essentially already happening with the Colonials right now? Are they a big galactic threat to the natives? So there's something to think about. It's all just making players that extra little bit like, oh, okay, crazy. Another very good way to make a finale threat respectable is to make sure that you have no predetermined outcome or consequences. There may very well be the chance that this big bad destroys a player nation, or kills a player character, or changes the setting forever, which is really what you want, with its passage. It also makes sure that there are real stakes at play which draw players in and try to make a difference, and has everyone clinging to the same sense of powerlessness if they do not act against it. A good example of this in Ancerious, and it's not necessarily even for a big bad, is the market crash, where this thing happens and suddenly it's like, by the way guys, you're no longer producing this material that's profitable anymore. And as a response, everyone was scrambling to write news posts of either taking advantage of it or, dealing with the consequences. You want a big bad to do the same. You want it to turn up and be like, I'm here, the setting has changed forever, some big shit's just happened, if you do not try to stop me, everything's gone. Your nation is probably going to die, and everyone's going to start fucking scrambling to do anything to try and counter it or rally against it. Because if they don't, they will feel powerless. And it will make them feel that little bit of twinge of fear of, oh god, my thing might be destroyed. Oh god, this might be it. This is the big showdown, And it gets players excited as well. Terrified, but excited. So, such threats also need to be active and out there. They need to be constantly interacting with other nations, different characters, different plot lines. It should be pervasive. These threats should be absolutely pervasive and reflect on the setting that its presence is a serious key issue. And this could be working with plenty of other players in order to ensure that, it's constantly active and there in the fret of everyone's minds. So you basically want it to be like, I'm here, everything's changed, you need to deal with this. And I'm going to be everywhere at once. Whether that is a psionic virus running rampant across the galaxy, or some big wall of battleships from a precursor nation that's currently tearing through an entire sector of space. These things you need to think about. So, how do you create a plotline around such a massive threat? Well, you need to put the effort in, as we've said, usually having several entire story arcs which are tied to the threat in some way, building up and establishing its appearance/arrival. Each need to be consistent and build off one another, and you should allow players to interact every step of the way. When the threat arrives, it should be a major moment, and one moment which should be setting defining and makes players go, oh shit, and immediately make, reactions to it, scramble to make reactions to it. Throughout whatever war, conflict, or arc that involves the big bad, there should be multiple lesser stories. You should always have little side stories and side arcs that go through it. These should delve into the big bad, what the motive is, weaknesses potentially, and just generally allow players to interact with it in a way that fleshes it out for the benefit of the story, but also fleshes out people's reactions to it and the effects on the setting for the benefit of the story and everyone else. And basically get people to just interact, find weaknesses, try and fight it, maybe have it subvert some key characters, just generally have fun and have it be there at the centre. And as said, you really want players to be involved at every turn. Whether that be fighting back, being subverted, working with others, whatever. The threat should just dominate. Even non-direct RPs that are not directly involving the threat in a battle or an RP, should have an influence. Your couple of dudes talking about the massive, crazy assault on Globnark 4, they might be terrified about the prospect of it coming to their system next. So they're going to talk about it. Your big diplomatic, speeches and everything are going to be revolving around, fighting this threat. Everyone might be trying to scramble to make alliances because of it. The economic situation may change because of it. Galactic politics and the politics of individual nations may change because of the effects of this massive threat. And so even though the threat is not directly in that RP with you, it is influencing your decisions and stories purely through existing. And as shown, Market Crash is a good example of that, even though it's not technically a super mega endgame threat. So you should always think about its effects and what happens next. And even subversive and insidious threats, which may be acting behind the scenes, should be setting changing. A silent weapon, as we said, would cause upheaval across the entire galaxy, even in a nation that it might not have actually got to yet. There should always be enough going on to make the threat credible and to have it dominate the setting and be active. So, as we said, while it's not good to have a predetermined outcome, you are allowed to have predetermined, little story arcs out there. These should really be with other players. For example, Grady's nation gets invaded in a massive push that then brings Gearshift, Ivepop, and Spookerchad in. And that's like a little sort of microcosm of the war, where there's a massive fight on that front and all these nations have to work together to save Grady's nation. Do they manage to save his nation? Does it get destroyed? Does this have knock-on effects? Well, who knows? Maybe we've all agreed that there is going to be a direct outcome to that. Maybe we haven't. But there is a small story that's going to add to the story. Perhaps the threat goes after a powerful artifact which could accelerate its goals. And if players don't stop it, or perhaps there is a little arc about it, and they discover some ancient weapons, perhaps that could, have knock-on possibilities for later. Maybe again, that's predetermined, where a particular player wants to do something pretty cool, and, defining, and you can be alright with that and work with them. While others, you can have no predetermined outcome, and, everyone might die horribly and vat their own entrails. So, sort of like bringing this all together is how to tie fear and horror into a big bad, like a big giant threat. So many writers use fear and horror in their reveals of big threats. For example, a character or threat meddling, subverting from the shadows, etc., or a threat which is truly massive and threatens the very existing of a setting. Drop feeding, readers these little tidbits in a way through horror RPs can heighten the feeling of surprise and dread when such a massive end threat is finally revealed. For example, in Ancerious, the unnamed frequently make small appearances in little RPs. Meddling here and there, sometimes doing bits and pieces. Quite a lot of the time, they're stopped in their little machinations. But when they actually turn up in RP, properly, with forces at their command, and intent on achieving an objective, people normally shit themselves and go, oh fucking hell, it's the unnamed, we're screwed. Case in point, numerous little RPs, and also Tabletop, which we do on every Saturday. People go, oh fuck, and it really heightens it for when they actually do turn up in force. These are little things that you want to sort of lay out with any big bads that you're going to create. Now, another cool little thing of using fear and horror to elevate a big bad is you could run a terrifying, sort of small-scale horror RP. So, for example, the one that I was doing with Canis, Chris and Drac on that small space station. Perhaps the creature that they're fighting is some, pretty fast, lethal, terrifying entity that managed to actually kill the security detachment of this place and cripple all of its defences, single-handedly. Now, if I reveal to them at the end of that RP that one creature is the foot soldier of a larger big bad, everyone's then going to go, oh fuck, that's not good. And then when those creatures turn up in the future to fight people on battlefields, everyone will know what they're capable of and be fearful of them because they've already seen what has been established and consistently laid down in other smaller plots. Nobody's going to question it when those things start tearing apart battle tanks when they've already seen one of them take out an entire spaceport. See where I'm going? Another sort of key interesting factor is don't intentionally go out of your way to make your big finale threats scary. The best way to make them horrifying is through their drives, their motives, their design, and how they act in RP. Big scary dimensional monsters which are written as incomprehensibly scary won't actually be treated as scary if they don't have the looks, the motives, and the complex write-up to back that up. Meanwhile, if somebody has been writing a villain who has the motive of actual genocide, has a realistic pursuable reason to be going for that, and has established items in RP that are extremely powerful and potent and threatening, and he also looks the part and has been built up, people are going to take him as a seriously terrifying threat. Always try to differentiate between what's scary and what's intimidating. Key example of the last part being Thanos, really. He's pretty intimidating, but he can also be quite scary in that, he has a realistic motive for what he's trying to do, and he's trying to genocide half the universe. You want to give them motives that make sense. And through those motives go, I can kind of see where he's coming from. And in that, people will be like, ooh, that's not great, that's pretty scary. So, sort of leading from that, sometimes more mundane evil and horror is better than large existential evil. Sure, big reality distorting horrors can be scary, but so can everyday mass murderers, stalkers, and insane people, especially on a much character-based level. In a character-based setting in a town or a space station, knowing that there's a mass murderer on the loose is extremely, horrifying in that setting. And any character interaction would be very on edge if there's a killer about and they're not known. I mean, you could be doing an RP with somebody in, a space station, and all of a sudden the dude that you're RPing with just gets killed from nowhere. You have no idea where that's come from. And you know that the mass murderer has just shot them from afar or something. It could have been you. And, just these sort of mundane horrors can really turn people to be like, oh, bloody hell. And it also fits with smaller scale settings. So, this brings us to the big meme section, which everyone usually enjoys, which is what to desperately avoid when creating a big bad threat. Number 1. Generic devouring swarm / dimensional incursion number 69. Just nobody is particularly impressed with these types of big bads. They're overdone, they're a trope for a reason, and they're very, very hard to write. You can't really write from a character perspective of a hive queen, or some indescribable horror that's supposedly beyond your ability to write from another dimension. They're just so overused, you can't write them, they don't have massive story potential, and in the end, they're for game systems like Warhammer 40k or Stellaris. You don't want them in a cooperative writing setting. Next up, you do not want to pull your big bad literally out of nowhere without prior setup, especially in a cooperative writing group. If tomorrow I put up a ping in the RP server saying that I'm bringing in a dimensional incursion of 20 billion ships with god tech, and they're all big scary and blah 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 blah, it's a big bad, nobody in Ankh would take me seriously, everyone would ignore me, and it would be retconned within 20 seconds. Nobody's going to care. But if after this big arc that's going on at the moment, I pull the Panopticon out and go, okay, boys, have fun with this one. They're now a credible threat to the galaxy. Everyone's going to be like, shit. Fuck, that's not good, that's terrifying. Suddenly the Panopticon are out and about doing stuff in public. And everyone's then going to do a mad dash to try and be like, oh, okay, how do I counter them? How do I fight them? What are they doing? How's that going to affect my nation? And, people are actually going to give a fuck. But if you're not consistently setting stuff up, nobody will care. You see it constantly in other sci-fi servers. So much. Where they're like, oh, what do we do for this month? I know, let's have a big extra galactic invasion. And they bring in Devouring Swarm number whatever out of nowhere. And they're just generic. They've had no prior setup. And everyone gets bored of it in like 3 days. And nobody has any reason to care. Because, well, why would they? I wouldn't have any reason to care. I'd just ignore it. And you just have like these big crazy, end-tier threats turn up every Tuesday, essentially. And be like, oh, let's spin the wheel roulette of what trope turns up this week. So, again, as I sort of said earlier, any situation where it breaks the setting or group rules just to be overpowered, it's crap. If you have to break the setting and the group rules in order to make something powerful enough to fight other players, it's cancer. Now, of course, there's going to be exceptions to this if it makes sense and is consistent for the setting. For example, as I said earlier, I decide to break the rules in Ancerious and allow this big bad to appear out of nowhere with 50 billion ships when the usual is 6,000 maximum per player, and they're all going to be god tech despite the fact that players are only allowed very superior at maximum, and they're all going to be allowed to bypass interdiction despite the fact that no other faction in the entire galaxy has that ability. And it's all just to fight. Well, that's retarded. Why? Well, why do they get all those bonuses? You can instead use the rules and use the setting to create a big bad that's actually fucking terrifying and is a massive threat to everyone. Case in point, the army of the Panopticon. They've got hardly any ships at the moment. They have a tiny territory. They've got very superior tech, but they don't have god tech. And they've got powerful entities and characters that are fully within the rules. And yet, they're fucking up a load of people, and they're going to be turning into a massive galactic scale threat at some point in the future. And they will be doing so completely within the same constraints as any other player. Now, on the flip side of that, the old invaders, as a galactic threat, have truly untold amounts of ships. But they are worse in every conceivable way to player ships. They are very inferior, they are von Neumann ships, they have no FTL, and they basically just attack in like sheer swarms. And the way they win is they just make you run out of ammunition and just overwhelm you. So because of that, it makes sense, also given their backstory, which I won't go into because spoilers, for them to have, inverted commas, near infinite ships. But that's an exception that you don't always want to go for. And it kind of subverts people because they have endless ships, but they're absolutely shockingly shite, and you're going to kick the shit out of them in virtually every battle. So, this kind of also ties to the next point, which is a lot of people like to create big bads as some super OP precursor race that can just whack players for the pure sake of it. Many people, especially if they're new to RP, love to come into group settings and be like, oh, I know what will make everyone love me and interact with me. I'm going to create the super duper Wraith Empire who all have god tech and they come out of the ancient timeline and they've got super duper powers and they like annihilate everything and I'm going to invade you and you. Haha, you basically get fucked. Again, nobody's going to care. especially for the fact that they're getting invaded. It's going to be retconned pretty quickly, and it's just going to get ignored by the community. It doesn't add to anything. If you're going to create a big bad, it needs to be for a reason, and it needs to contribute and build a setting, as well as help and contribute to building player experience, as anything else in the group should do. Big bad should not be an exception, and big bad should not be used, especially by like GMs or admins, to just abuse players for the sake of abusing players, especially if they break any form of rules. That just makes no sense, it's scummy, and it's just retarded. Again, next, having no motivation other than they're hungry or they're evil for your big bad nation. Their actions should always be defined. Their motive should always be defined. If they have no motive other than just they're evil, nobody's going to fucking care, because they're not going to have any story behind them. Who cares about the super ancient pee-pee poo-poo Reich, who all have god tech and everything, and, they're just evil. Okay, well, they're not going to have any story behind them, are they? Like, why am I going to interact with something if I know that they're not really going to have any story, or that their motive is just completely balked? Like, I'll interact with interesting bad guys because of their motivations. Motivations make bad guys. If your bad guy has no motivation, Jesus Christ, you failed at writing. And big bad should be no exception. They should have as many avenues for story as possible. And they should add to the setting through their motives. And it should tie into the story as a whole as well. For example, the army of their Panopticon are the gatekeepers of, inverted commas, heaven, which is the Panopticon itself, a strange psionic realm which is still developing itself within the galaxy Scion field. They want to control it and have pure access over it, as well as then end, more or less, all life in the galaxy by making everyone absent, aka soulless, so they can just, awaken the Panopticon early and then casually puppet any living thing in the galaxy to do their bidding. Boom. That's a realistic motivation. And it also makes them bad guys. Yeah, they're fucking evil, and you know they're fucking evil, and they probably know they're fucking evil, but it gives them a chance to have a power that nobody else has ever been able to attain in the galaxy. So of course they're going to pursue it. Why wouldn't you? These are the things that you need to think about when you're writing up big bads. Another thing is putting little detail into them and changing aspects on a whim when needed to counter player actions. If your big super bad guy is not fully fleshed out with designs, aesthetic, appearances, consistent tech base, their capabilities, their weaknesses, their histories, their strengths, if everything is not set out, well, why not? Why are you throwing them in half-baked? And if people go, oh, well, I'll flesh them out as we go along, no. Because that allows you to change things on the fly. Now, while all good stories and factions change as things progress, you're going to have new ideas, you're going to be like, oh my god, this actually fits in with this other plot line and I didn't think of it before, therefore I'm going to sort of like veer it at the last second to fit in for a better experience for everyone. These things happen. That's fine. What's not fine is you taking your big bad to fight Canis' faction, for example. And they have these very defined traits in that they've got amazingly good weaponry and they're super duper duper fast, but they're very easy to kill. But then when I go and attack Korra's nation, they're slow and they're super duper tanky, but they don't hit hard. And conveniently, these are the ways to essentially hard counter Canis and Korra's fleets. So what changed? Why did it change? Why have you changed their abilities just to be able to counter somebody who's attacking? You might also, if you're playing a big bad guy who's getting, or a big bad nation that's getting the shit kicked out of it in an RP, be tempted to pull something out of your ass to go, ho ho ho, this evil big thing is here to fuck you up now. Only do that if it makes sense and is established. If it's not, you shouldn't be doing that, because that's setting a precedent, and it means that you might do it in the future when things are not going your way. And it's a very slippery slope. Also, do not make your big bad finale a casual threat, which doesn't really do much, but yet is constantly touted by itself and other factions as this super big evil thing and how much of a threat it is. For example, we have had nations in Ancerious that have come into the galaxy, been a titanic threat, supposedly, from their creator, case in point, the Aberration, where it's this supermassive threat, it's going to destroy everything, it's going to beat everyone, it's constantly out there lurking, you need to be threatened by it, but it doesn't actually do anything in character, and it doesn't interact with anyone. So, why would I be scared of it? If it's just sitting in its corner of the galaxy, just, crying to itself at night, why do I give a shit? Now, if it's up in my fucking face, doing shit, subverting nations around me, attacking people, fucking around on the galactic stage, absolutely, I'm going to be like, oh shit, this is a fucking threat. But you can't just have it sit there and do nothing. Even if it is a subversive, behind-the-scenes threat, it should be doing stuff constantly in a way that has nations being second-guessing themselves with what's going on. You always want to be in players' minds, and as said, it should always be changing the setting and have an impact on the setting. If it's not doing that, it's not a fucking threat, it's just another regular faction. Again, sort of covered earlier, if you create these big sort of bad super factions for your finale, and you use it in any way to shoehorn it into the ancient storyline or lore, well, it's already established, and if you don't talk to people about it, it creates continuity issues. If somebody comes into the group and says, oh, well, my faction's from blah, 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 how many thousand years ago, we have to find a way to make that work in the lore, or say no. An ancient finale is going to be even more so. There needs to be a reason why, all of the ancient timeline wasn't affected by it. There needs to be a reason, for its origin, its motives. It needs to be tied to things. It needs to be tied to plot lines. And if you're willing to just throw continuity out to the wind, you honestly don't care about the setting, which says more about you than it does anything else. And again, don't make a subversive big bad which barely interacts, right, behind the scenes. Maybe it's in 3 RPs, and it barely does anything. And then all of a sudden, it just bursts onto the scene and just fucking yeets 10 people's factions. And I know that Goose will probably be, where if he listens to this, will be like, oh wait, hold on a minute. I am kind of referencing that, but don't worry, I'm not shit-talking him. There have been instances where it's kind of there's a little bit of setup but not quite enough, and then all of a sudden you have the big emergent moment where shit hits the fan, but it's done in a way that angers players rather than makes them go, oh shit, what we knew was coming is finally here. So you kind of want to avoid that. You want to give plenty of lead up, and you want to give players plenty of warning. But again, you want to work with players to ensure that when that big emergence comes, it's fucking scary. And nobody goes, oh, what the fuck, you just got modded me, or you just ruined whatever thing. So, that pretty much covers that. And that covers the extent of what I have for you for tonight. Do you guys have any questions to put in context chat at all? For me to answer, if you're unsure or have anything in particular to add. So Brank says, what would you say has been the best big bad to come to Ancerios? Army of the Panopticon. Hands down. Like, as much as I love the Unnamed as a faction that I created, Army of the Panopticon. The reason why is as follows. The Army of the Panopticon are totally organic. We did not create them to be a big galactic threat. They have organically changed from their inception into that, purely through RP and story. They started out as some obscure piece of lore in the Empire of Capital, and now they are building up at current through most of like these different sort of plot lines that I'm running to becoming a galactic scale threat, and they will threaten the galaxy. And galactic factions will be like, oh shit, this is a problem, and there will be a big finale and culmination of that arc, and there will be lots and lots and lots of setup along the way for players to interact, for there to be character interaction, for there to be subversion, for there to be fleet battles, for there to be, chances for players to stop them and defeat them and like foil their plans and stuff. There's going to be plenty of that, and there already has been quite a lot of build up. So yeah, like, and the thing is as well is that the Army of the Panopticon not only organically got created, but they've helped develop the setting. The Panopticon now exists. We've delved into the Scion much more, and they've helped flesh out a lot of different aspects, and they've also allowed, one of the best parts, RPs now with entities and gods. We never really had much of that after First Ancerios War, because of numerous reasons, and now we're delving back into that style of RP again, and it's really fun. And everyone respects them as well. They've been built up in such a way that everyone knows that the Army of the Panopticon is a massive threat, and to take them seriously when they appear in RP. And because of that, they are, in my opinion, the best big bad to come to Ancerios. While we have several, and we have some set up, Army of the Panopticon hands down, because they never started out with the intention of being one. Any other questions? If anyone wants to ask on voice, you're also allowed to do so. See blank typing. Alright. Red, are you going to say something?
Yeah, if you're trying to write a big bad, because you don't want to go the direction of trying to rip off Lovecraft beyond comprehension. But how do you, if you're trying to go that route of something that's kind of nebulous, how would you go about it properly rather than just being lazy and saying, "Oh, it's beyond comprehension, I can't describe it." Like
Use
something
concepts.
that's
If
like a shapeshifter or something.
Yeah, use concepts. You might not be able to tell someone exactly what it looks like, but you can give descriptions to make the reader have an idea of what it looks like to them. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. You could use nebulous terms and that, but as long as you don't say like indescribable, you could say like for example, the thing was not totally in like real space. There was a shimmer where it was. The character caught strange sights of different limbs shimmering out of it, in and out of existence. Sometimes they look like this, sometimes they look like this. Its form was ever changing, and it wasn't quite in tune with the realm of physics. But it's better that than saying like it was an indescribable blob of pure energy that she just couldn't understand or whatever. Like, that's how you would pretty much go about it, in my opinion.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Anyone else? Or is that a wrap? Awesome. I think that's a wrap. Well, thank you all for coming, and we will catch you again soon.